Introducing Bluehost Cloud, ultra-fast WordPress hosting with 100% uptime. Want a website with unmatched power, speed, and control? Of course you do. And now you can have all three with Bluehost Cloud, the new web hosting plan from Bluehost. With 100% uptime and incredibly speedy load times, your WordPress websites will be dependable and lightning fast on a global scale. Plus, your sites can handle even the biggest traffic spikes without going down or lagging. And with Bluehost Cloud, you get 24/7 WordPress priority support, meaning you're connected to WordPress experts anytime you need them. Not to mention, you automatically get daily backups and world-class security. So, what are you waiting for? Get Bluehost Cloud today by visiting Bluehost.com. That's Bluehost.com.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode Top Secret, The Strange Inventions of World War II. Take your pick, ladies and gentlemen, between the two following sayings. Necessity is the mother of invention, or desperate times call for desperate measures. Either way, once and before the war broke out in Europe, both sides sought to use technology to give them an edge. Let's see how that went. First, there's the solid, actual war-changing creations or improvements of things like the Soviet T-34 tank, the British Spitfire or Hurricane, or the Americans' B-17 Flying Fortress. Yet all of these were outdone by the creation of the atomic bomb. But before going on to the items that bombed all on their own, it's worth mentioning that the war also created the need for things like synthetic rubber, the Jeep, and the item that never fails, it never lets you down, duct tape. And then we get to those ideas, those inspirations, that leaves the rest of us scratching our heads. Because someone somewhere, a second person, heard one of these ideas and said, yeah, let's do that. That's the ticket. Let's see how that went. The first item was to be the answer to breaking, literally, Hitler's Atlantic Wall, built to keep the Allies out of mainland Europe. The required specification said the device had to penetrate a 10-foot or 3-meter thick concrete wall or structure, and it had to be launched from landing craft along the beach. Enter the DMWD, or the Admiralty's Directorate of Miscellaneous Weapons Development. Perhaps the name should have been DUMP instead, after Sub-Lieutenant Neville Shute revealed the Panjandrum. Think of 2 large carriage wheels attached by a metal drum turned on its side. The drum would be filled with explosives to go off after making contact with the intended wall. As for getting the Panjandrum from the beach to the wall, the 2 wheels would have a set of cordite rockets attached to them. They would go off, obviously pointing all in the same direction, and the wheels would start to turn. As it was expected to get up to 60 miles per hour, no steering device was possible. It would simply slam into a wall and then detonate. If all went well, then there would be a new hole, one big enough for a tank to drive through. Simplicity itself. September 7th, 1943, would see the trial run for this item, but as word got out, many of the locals came by to their beach to see what was going on, and their curiosity almost got them killed. As this was its maiden voyage, only a few cordite rockets were attached to the wheels. Still, when they were ignited, the Panjandrum started rolling. It left the landing craft and went a far distance up the beach, that is, before some of the rockets on its right wheel failed. The device started turning to the one side, now off course. Fortunately, nobody was hurt. This would be tried over and over, but the self-propelled bomb refused to fly right, or rather roll straight. It was scrapped eventually, but clearly the British under the gun were not turning away anything that had any chance of making a difference in this war. Speaking of gaining the advantage over one's opponent, as there would be much urban warfare, a gun that could shoot around corners would offer obvious advantages. And the Germans therefore created the Kumlauf, a Sturmgewehr 44 assault rifle with a modified barrel. The first 4 inches of this 14-inch barrel were straight, coming out of the body of the gun. The next 5.5 inches, however, were curved, and then the last 4.5 inches went straight again. Thus the bullet would come out, make the turn, and then head out. And as it had a periscope, so the shooter could see what was around the corner to help him take aim. Yes, I know, it sounds like a weapon that WWII Coyote would have ordered from the Acme Corporation to finally catch the Roadrunner, but it did work. Kind of. The curved part of the barrel would often break the bullets in half before exiting, so it was good, it was effective, at short range. But this kind of defeated the purpose. And after it was fired 150 times, safety for the user became an issue. Thus, few made it to the battlefield or were actually used, but the Germans, especially in the East, needed an advantage over the Soviets, and this seemed a winner. The best laid plans of mice and men.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Something that showed much more promise was the Goliath tracked mine, a rather boring name for a remote-controlled explosive, the idea being to guide it under an enemy tank and then detonate its 132 pounds or 60 kilograms of high explosives. But let's back up a little bit. In 1940, after France was defeated, the conquerors found something strange in the River Seine, a remote-controlled prototype vehicle. Inspired, the Germans worked on using this against enemy tanks. When it was ready, the creators and intended victims discovered several flaws. First, the device was controlled by a 2,132-foot-long cable. Enemy soldiers quickly figured out to cut the wire, normally by a grenade, that would stop the threat. And this was possible as they had plenty of time. Why? Because the Goliath only went 6 miles an hour, and it got stuck easily. But its thin armor also allowed the enemy to simply shoot it while it moved forward and wreck it. Sadly, these maneuverable explosives were used during the Warsaw Uprising and during the Normandy invasion. In all, just over 7,000 of these Goliaths were built, but most were not used. As for other inventions, we can skip right over the exploding dead rats, meant to be disposed of by the enemy by throwing them in their nearby boiler. The dead rats would be dropped from planes only to places that had boilers nearby. The explosives inside the dead rodent would eventually go off, and the boiler would be wrecked, and the enemy would no longer have power to continue operations or to, say, heat to stay warm. Only slightly less kooky was the idea of using bats to burn Japanese buildings. Leaving aside any jokes about the Caped Crusader, the idea was dreamed up by a Pennsylvania dentist, Little S. Adams. The idea was straightforward and had more to do with getting back at the Japanese after Pearl Harbor than a true war weapon, which is probably why it received funding. Regardless, about 1,000 Mexican free-tailed bats were captured, and they had tiny napalm incendiary devices attached to them. The bats would be put in containers and then, yes, dropped from a plane. But before hitting the earth, the devices would open up, and the bats, most of them would fly out and escape, taking up residence in some nearby structure. The incendiaries inside would eventually go off, and whammo, instant firestorm. And yet, Some, or rather, enough of the bats did not do their patriotic duty. They would escape and prematurely set off fires, mostly in U.S. storage areas, but one time a general's Jeep was the unintended victim. In late December 1943, the Marines took over the program, but by then, interest began to die off. Why? There were whispers of some new massive bomb being built that could destroy a city, and this made the bats meaningless, kind of like going from Batman to Superman, all in one go. And then there's the most intangible weapon of all, the bad smell. In 1943, Private Ernest Crocker, a chemist, had been working on poisonous gases for the military. Then he was put on a team that would develop a stink bomb, one mighty enough to free France. Well, not really, but it was potent. The idea, and bear with me here, was to get these to France, then to resistance members, who would spray a passing-by German officer with this substance, and it had inside of it vomit, rotten eggs, foot odor, and, of course, excrement. It was to be called, Who, me? As in, who, me? I don't smell like that. Anyway, the idea was to embarrass German officers who would be ostracized by their men and thus lower morale. Desperate times, desperate measures. The smell was created. Now, they just needed proper packaging. As this was trial and error as well, the error ended up with the workers covered in this smell, and they were not welcomed home for weeks. Not all heroes wear capes. The packaging was eventually figured out. About 600 units of Who Me were sent to Europe, but then the war ended before mass use could be carried out. C'est la vie. And then there was the gun that wasn't a gun. After the Americans entered the war, their industrial might was accessible to the Allies like never before. So it makes sense that a Polish military attaché, wanting to see his country free, or at the very least, be able to fight back, came up with an idea in March of 1942. The project was given over to the U.S. Army Joint Psychological Warfare Committee and designed by the U.S. Army, under the leadership of George Hyde of the Inland Manufacturing Division of General Motors Corporation in Dayton, Ohio. Specifically, the mass production would be carried out by General Motors' Guide Lamp Division, so the Inland Division could focus on the mass production of M1 carbine, a semi-automatic carbine which weighed less than the full-size M1 rifle. The object itself was to be called the FLair projector caliber 45, but it was not a flare gun. Its name was a red herring. No, though simple in design, it used a .45 automatic cartridge, more than effective at close range. And by close by, I mean 8 yards. It only had 23 steel parts, mostly stamped sheet metal. So it could be mass-produced, but more on that in a moment. The way this gun worked was one had to pull back the cocky knob and then turn it a little bit to one side or the other. This allowed one to put a .45 cartridge inside. But before the bullet goes in, a small breech block has to be lifted straight up. Think of the breech block as a small metal wall that will sit in behind the bullet once it is in place. Then the cocky knob, which was pulled back and turned, has a firing pin attached to it. It has to be turned back and put into place, and then the gun is ready to fire. The handle of this gun is hollow and can hold 5 bullets, and when these were dropped from planes, they were in small wooden boxes containing the FP45 Liberator pistol and 10 rounds. Oh, and one more item was in the box. A small wooden dowel was used to push the spent cartridge out once it was fired, or a thin stick could be used. Lastly, a step-by-step diagram of how to load and fire the gun was inside. The sheet had no words on it, as the anticipated recipients would be non-English speaking people. Given its simple design, the Guide Lamp Division plant in Anderson, Indiana, made 1 million of these during 6 months in the middle of 1942. The FLair pistol has been called the gun that wasn't a gun because it was talked about in hushed tones, using confusing jargon for its various pieces. Another selling point to the Army was that It was the gun to get a better gun. The idea here was, once these were in resistors' hands, they could be used up close, but if successful, then the enemy's gun could be taken, and in time, with enough of the enemy's guns, then real resistance could be offered up. Given what the U.S. was producing at the time for the war effort, this seemed like a drop in the ocean that may produce outsized results, and it was nicknamed the Liberator. Now that's just good marketing. But even if these airdrops were found by the Germans or the Japanese, it was still hoped to have a psychological effect on them, as in anyone around you could have one of these guns, so you'd better beware. Again, 1 million of these were made, but only half that was sent to the UK. The British were asked to drop these from their bombers over France, but London refused. Their argument was, I could drop 600 guns in one go, or I could drop bombs. We choose bombs. Moreover, General Eisenhower didn't see the use in them, so only about 25,000 of them were given to the French resistance. Generals Joseph Stilwell and Douglas MacArthur felt the same way as Ike. In time, the SOE, or Special Operations Executive, did take a large number of these to Greece to help with the resistance there. Those given to the American OSS, or Office of Strategic Services, would sit idle because, before too long, the OSS was able to offer resistance fighters something much better. Still, other PF-45s in time would show up in India, China, and the Philippines. In fact, the last country used these post-war to arm their policemen. After the war, the majority of these were destroyed or dropped to the bottom of the ocean. The idea had been to help those who could not help themselves. The design of this was simple and thus easy to make, but it lacked firepower and range and gave the enemy plenty of time to shoot back while the operator reloaded. Still, this was another example of all those people thinking outside the box and desiring to have technology help them stand up to a power that threatened to last 1,000 years. Postscript. I have to share this one honorable mention. It's definitely outside the box. It worked, at least once, but it's still a head-scratcher. Nazi Germany invaded neutral Norway on April 9, 1940. Resistance ended on June 10, 1940. Norway had been neutral during the Great War, so assumed they would not be called upon or invaded during the next war. But they were wrong. Their ice-free ports would make it possible for U-boats to hopefully enter the Atlantic Ocean, and the iron ore from Sweden would be that much more secure if Germany controlled Sweden's neighbor. As this has been covered previously, essentially, the British cocked up their invasion of Norway, and the Germans won this contest. Holding the country for the duration of the war, the Norwegians were upset with their southern neighbor, and soon a resistance group, Milorg, was created. It would have about 40,000 members by the end of the war, but there's one instance that I'd like to cover. Norway's coastline has an economy that's primarily based on salted fish. So, no surprise, once the Germans were in control of the country, they told the locals that Germany was taking the country's entire catch of sardines. The Norwegians were pissed, which only boosted their resistance. And one such resistor had access to Nazi headquarters in the country. He told the resistance that the sardines would be going to feed the German troops and that canned food would be going to the U-boat crews. Seeing an opportunity, the resistance got in touch with the British, who fielded a rather strange request for croton oil. This oil has a fishy taste, but it also has a powerful laxative side effect. Again, the resistance was on the job. They smuggled the oil to the canneries, who mixed it in with the vegetable oil. These shipments went out to the German submarines. There is only one known official instance when this oil hit the German subcrew at the wrong or right time. But other than that, larger operations could never be implemented as the war ended. So imagine dozens of cramped men in a sub, and there's only one head or toilet near the captain's quarters, and suddenly almost everyone has to go to the bathroom at the same time. Croton oil is a lot like war. It's all promise when starting, but in the end, forgive the pun, it's painful to bring things to a close.
Americans love using their credit cards, the most secure and hassle-free way to pay. But D.C. politicians want to change that with the Durbin-Marshall credit card bill. This bill lets corporate megastores pick how your credit card is processed, allowing them to use untested payment networks that jeopardize your data security and rewards. Corporate megastores will make more money, and you pay the price. Tell Congress to guard your card, because Americans lose when politicians choose. Learn more at guardyourcard.com.